Some secrets are buried so deep they become the foundation of entire towns. The neon sign of the Broken Spur Saloon flickered against the Nevada desert night as forensic accountant Margaret Chen pushed through the heavy wooden doors, rain dripping from her city clothes onto sawdust floors. She'd come to Dust Devil to settle her grandfather's estate, a man who'd been nothing but a ghost story from her childhood. But 3 weeks of sorting through his belongings had revealed something chilling. Meticulously kept journals documenting 60 years of the town's darkest secrets, written in a code only a forensic mind could crack. The locals saw her as easy prey, a soft city woman with her designer boots and rental car, when the charming rancher, Jake Morrison, leaned close with his weathered smile and whispered his proposition. The entire bar expected another conquest story. Instead, Maggie's quiet response about 3 unsolved murders sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Now she sits at that same bar, knowing she holds evidence that could destroy half the town. Every friendly face might be hiding a killer. Every smile might be masking decades of buried guilt. The question isn't whether she'll survive the night. It's whether the truth will survive long enough to see daylight. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Maggie's fingers remained steady around her whiskey glass, though every instinct screamed at her to run. The storm outside hammered against the windows with increasing fury, as if nature itself was demanding answers to questions this town had buried long ago. Jake Morrison still stood beside her bar stool, but his easy charm had evaporated like morning mist. His weathered hand, which moments ago had been moving toward her shoulder in what he assumed would be a victorious gesture, now hung suspended in the air between them. The confidence that had carried him across the room, the same swagger that had probably worked on countless other women, had cracked like drought-hardened earth. "What did you just say?" His voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. Maggie took a measured sip of her drink, letting the amber liquid burn away the metallic taste of fear. Around them, conversations had died mid-sentence. The old-timer in the corner booth stopped shuffling his cards. Even the bartender, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks, had frozen while polishing a glass that was already spotless. "I said the Henley girl wasn't the first." Maggie's voice remained level, professional, the same tone she'd used in countless corporate boardrooms when presenting findings that would ruin careers. Sarah Henley, 1987, found in Copper Canyon with her throat cut, but before her came Maria Santos in 1962, same method, same location. And before Maria, there was Patricia Lawson in 1943. The color drained from Jake's face like water from a broken dam. Behind him, an older woman with silver hair and a faded floral dress dropped her beer bottle. It shattered against the floor, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. That's impossible," the woman whispered. "Nobody knows about Patricia?" Maggie turned slightly on her stool, finally allowing herself to look around the room. Every face stared back at her with varying degrees of shock, recognition, and something that looked dangerously close to panic. Patricia Lawson, 17 years old, came to Dust Devil in the summer of 1943 to work as a seamstress. She was 3 months pregnant when she died. The father was never officially identified. The woman's hand flew to her mouth, but not before Maggie caught the flash of recognition in her eyes. Others in the bar shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances that spoke of shared knowledge and shared guilt. Thunder crashed overhead, and the lights flickered. In that moment of semi-darkness, Maggie felt the weight of 60 years of buried truth pressing down on the room like a physical force. When the lights steadied, she saw that several patrons had quietly moved closer to the exits. "You don't know what you're talking about, lady." This came from a heavy-set man in work clothes near the pool table. His voice carried the kind of forced bravado that usually preceded violence. "Maybe you should finish your drink and head back to whatever city you crawled out of." Maggie smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Mr. Garrett. You see, I haven't finished reading my grandfather's journals yet. Edgar Chen, though I suppose most of you knew him as Eddie, was quite thorough in his record-keeping. 47 years working in this town's post office, hearing every conversation, seeing every secret transaction, watching every guilty face that came through his door. The name hit the room like a physical blow. Several people actually stepped backward, and she heard at least 2 sharp intakes of breath. Jake's face had gone from pale to grey. "Eddie Chen was your grandfather?" The question came from the bartender, his voice barely above a whisper. He was. Funny thing about postal workers, people forget they exist. They see them every day, hand them their mail, conduct their business right in front of them, and somehow forget they have eyes and ears. My grandfather documented everything. Names, dates, amounts of money that changed hands, conversations he overheard, license plates of cars that shouldn't have been in certain places at certain times. She paused, letting the implications sink in. He even kept samples. Samples of what? Jake's question came out as a croak. DNA evidence wasn't available in 1943, Mr. Morrison, but my grandfather was a careful man. He kept hair samples, fabric fibers, even blood from crime scenes that the local sheriff somehow missed during his investigations. Technology has come a long way since then. The storm chose that moment to unleash its full fury. Wind howled around the building like a living thing, and the lights flickered again. In the intermittent darkness, Maggie caught glimpses of faces transformed by fear and desperation. She realized with crystalline clarity that every person in this room was connected to the secrets buried in her grandfather's journals. She also realized that some of them would kill to keep those secrets buried. The question now wasn't whether she'd survive the night. The question was whether justice delayed for 60 years was strong enough to overcome the collective guilt of an entire town willing to do anything to protect their buried sins. The silence that followed her revelation felt alive, breathing with the collective held breath of a dozen guilty souls. Maggie found herself thinking, absurdly, of her Tuesday morning routine back in San Francisco. How she'd wake at 5:47 a.m. sharp, 3 minutes before her alarm, pour herself Ethiopian coffee in her favorite blue mug, and review case files, while NPR murmured softly from the kitchen radio. Such a simple, predictable life. Such a safe life. She'd built that safety deliberately, brick by brick, after her mother's death, when Maggie was 28. No surprises, no chaos, no emotional landmines waiting to detonate without warning. Her corner office on the 32nd floor overlooked the bay, and she could watch ferries trace their predictable paths between Sausalito and the city while she dissected corporate balance sheets, hunting for the lies that greedy men thought they'd hidden in columns of numbers. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent 14 years following paper trails to expose corruption, only to inherit the motherlode of all paper trails from a grandfather she barely remembered. "You should leave," Jake said quietly, his voice stripped of its earlier confidence. The storm outside punctuated his words with another crack of thunder. "Tonight, before morning." The threat was clear, but Maggie felt that familiar surge of stubborn defiance that had made her the most feared forensic accountant in Northern California. It was the same feeling she'd had 3 months ago when Garrett and associates tried to intimidate her during the Pemberton Industries case. They'd sent lawyers, private investigators, even had someone follow her home. She'd responded by working 18-hour days until she'd unraveled their entire money laundering operation. "I can't do that," she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice remained. "You see, I took a leave of absence from my job to settle this estate. My partner at the firm thinks I'm having some kind of midlife crisis, driving out here to claim property from a man who never even sent me a birthday card." She thought of David's face when she'd told him she was leaving. They'd been together for 2 years, comfortable, uncomplicated, perfectly matched in their mutual appreciation for order and routine. He'd stood in her pristine kitchen, still holding his morning coffee, looking at her as if she'd announced plans to join the circus. "This isn't like you, Maggie," he'd said. which was exactly the problem. She'd built a life where nothing was like her anymore, where every day was a carefully constructed replica of the day before. No risks, no passion, no messy family entanglements. Just work, wine with David on Fridays, yoga on Saturdays, and the blessed predictability of a world where numbers never lied and people rarely surprised her. But the phone call from the lawyer had shattered that careful equilibrium. Edgar Chen, dead at 91, leaving her a house in Nevada, and questions she'd spent 30 years avoiding. Questions about why her mother had fled Dust Devil at 18 and never looked back. Why family photos stopped appearing after Maggie turned 8. Why her mother would sometimes stare out windows with an expression of such profound sadness that even as a child, Maggie had learned not to ask what she was thinking about. "My grandfather left me his house," she continued, watching faces around the room grow more tense. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and a basement full of filing cabinets that took me 6 days to catalogue. I found receipts for money orders sent to addresses that don't exist anymore. Photographs of license plates taken from his bedroom window. Copies of birth certificates and death certificates that don't match the official records. The older woman with silver hair made a small sound, like a wounded animal. "I also found letters," Maggie said softly. "Letters my mother wrote to him, begging him to stop whatever he was doing, telling him she was afraid. The last one was dated 3 weeks before she died in that car accident." She'd read that final letter so many times the paper had grown soft under her fingers, her mother's handwriting shaky with fear. "Please, Dad, let sleeping dogs lie. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep. Maggie doesn't know anything, and I want to keep it that way." The car accident that killed her mother suddenly didn't feel quite so accidental. "So you see," Maggie said, lifting her whiskey glass again, "I can't leave tonight. I have vacation days to use up, a very patient boyfriend who thinks I am soul-searching, and about 40 more boxes of evidence to review. I've already arranged to extend my stay at the roadside inn for another 2 weeks." The storm outside seemed to echo the room's collective intake of breath. In the flickering light, she saw something that made her blood turn to ice water. Several people were no longer looking at her with fear. They were looking at her with calculation. Her Tuesday morning routine felt very far away. The calculation in their eyes crystallized into something far more dangerous when the saloon doors burst open with a bang that made everyone jump. A figure emerged from the storm, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a sheriff's badge that caught the lamplight like a warning. Water dripped from his hat brim as he surveyed the frozen tableau, Maggie on her bar stool, Jake standing beside her like a statue, and a room full of people who looked like they'd been caught with their hands in the collection plate. "Evening, folks." Sheriff Tom Briggs had the kind of voice that commanded attention without raising volume. His gaze swept the room before settling on Maggie with uncomfortable intensity. "Heard we had a visitor in town. Thought I'd stop by and make sure everyone was getting along." The timing felt orchestrated, too convenient. Maggie's forensic mind automatically catalogued the details. How quickly he'd appeared after her revelations, how his presence seemed to shift the room's energy from panic to something more organized, more controlled. "Sheriff," Jake found his voice, though it still carried that tremor of fear. "This is Margaret Chen, Eddie's granddaughter." Recognition flickered across Briggs' weathered features, followed by something that looked suspiciously like resignation. "Miss Chen, I was sorry to hear about your grandfather's passing. Eddie was a fixture in this town for a long time." The careful phrasing made Maggie's skin crawl. Everything about this moment felt rehearsed, as if they'd all been waiting for this conversation for years, decades even. "Thank you, Sheriff. I was just telling everyone how thorough my grandfather was in his record-keeping." She kept her voice steady, professional, but her pulse hammered against her throat. Amazing what 47 years of documentation can reveal about a small town. Briggs removed his hat, water spattering the floor. In the lamplight, she could see he was older than she'd first thought, maybe 60, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines carved deep around his eyes, lines that spoke of hard decisions and harder secrets. "Miss Chen," Might I suggest you're operating under some misunderstandings about your grandfather's activities? His tone remained polite, but steel ran underneath it. Small towns have their own ways of handling problems. Sometimes outside perspectives can misinterpret local customs. Local customs, like covering up murders spanning 8 decades. The storm outside intensified, rattling windows and making the lights flicker again. In those moments of uncertain illumination, Maggie caught glimpses of silent communication passing between the sheriff and various patrons. Subtle nods, meaningful glances, the kind of wordless coordination that came from years of shared conspiracy. She thought of her mother's letters, hidden in a shoebox beneath winter coats her grandfather never wore. Letter after letter, growing more desperate, more frightened. "They know you're watching, Dad. They know you're keeping records. Please just stop. Please just let it go." But Eddie Chen hadn't let it go. He'd kept watching, kept documenting, kept building his case against an entire town's worth of guilty consciences. The question that had haunted Maggie for the past week suddenly crystallized. Had her mother's car accident really been an accident, or had it been a warning that went too far? "Sheriff," she said carefully, "I'm curious about something. My mother died in 1994, just outside of town. Single car accident, according to the report. But I found some interesting photographs in my grandfather's files. Photos of tire tracks that don't match her vehicle. Photos of paint scrapes that suggest another car was involved. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Briggs's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but Maggie caught it. After 14 years of reading faces across conference tables, she'd learned to spot the tells. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Chen." "I'm not making accusations, Sheriff. I'm simply stating facts." She finished her whiskey, the burn providing false courage. "Though I do find it interesting that the investigating officer on that case was Deputy Morrison, Jake's father, if I'm reading the family trees correctly." Jake stepped backward as if she'd slapped him. The movement was instinctive, guilty, and it told Maggie everything she needed to know about the Morrison family's involvement in her mother's death. The choice crystallized before her with stark clarity. She could apologize, claim misunderstanding, pack her rental car tonight, and drive back to San Francisco. Back to her Tuesday morning routine, her safe corner office, her relationship with David that never challenged or surprised her. She could choose the life she'd built so carefully, brick by brick, after her mother's death. Or she could stay in Dust Devil and follow this paper trail to its bloody conclusion, knowing that half the people in this room would sleep better as she joined her mother in an early grave. The storm howled around the building like something alive and hungry. In the flickering light, surrounded by faces that had moved from calculation to cold determination, Margaret Chen made the choice that would either bring justice to 3 generations of buried sins or ensure she became the 4th name in her grandfather's murder files. She smiled at Sheriff Briggs and ordered another whiskey. The bartender's hand hesitated over the bottle, his eyes flicking to Sheriff Briggs for permission. In that moment of uncertainty, Maggie felt the full weight of what she'd just committed herself to. The whiskey she'd already consumed buzzed through her system, creating a false sense of bravado that was rapidly dissolving into something closer to terror. "What the hell am I doing?" The thought hit her like a physical blow. Back in San Francisco, her biggest risk was crossing Market Street during rush hour. Here, she'd just painted a target on her back in front of a room full of people who'd spent decades protecting their secrets. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the fresh glass, and she had to concentrate to keep her breathing steady. Sheriff Briggs settled onto the stool beside her with deliberate casualness, but she could feel the tension radiating from his body. "You know, Miss Chen, I've been sheriff here for 18 years. In that time, I've learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing in a small town isn't what people do, it's what they think they know." The implied threat was clear, but what terrified Maggie more was her own reaction to it. Instead of the righteous anger that had sustained her through corporate battles, she felt something unfamiliar and deeply unsettling, genuine fear for her life. Not her career, not her reputation, but her actual physical existence. She thought of David's last text, sent just that morning, "Hope you're finding whatever you're looking for out there. Miss you." Such simple words, but they represented everything she'd built in the aftermath of her mother's death. Stability, safety, a life where the worst surprise was discovering someone had embezzled from their pension fund. "The thing is," she said, proud that her voice didn't shake, "I'm not sure I know anything yet. That's the problem." It was true, and the admission felt like stepping off a cliff. Her grandfather's journals were meticulous but cryptic, filled with references she didn't understand and connections she couldn't quite prove. She had names, dates, suspicious coincidences, but not the kind of ironclad evidence that would stand up in court. What she had were puzzle pieces that suggested a picture too horrifying to fully comprehend. "Then maybe," Briggs said softly, "this would be a good time to stop digging." The reasonable part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive and successful for 42 years, screamed agreement. She had enough money saved to disappear back to California tonight. She could sell the house sight unseen, donate the boxes of documents to some historical society, and pretend this week had never happened. In 6 months, this would just be an interesting story to tell at dinner parties. But her mother's face kept appearing in her mind. Not the broken woman who died when Maggie was 28, but the young girl in those faded photographs upstairs, bright-eyed, hopeful, unaware that her hometown would eventually try to kill her for knowing too much. How many other women had died to keep Dust Devil's secrets buried? How many more would die if Maggie walked away? Jake moved closer, his earlier charm completely evaporated. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but this isn't San Francisco. Out here, people handle problems differently." The casual brutality in his tone made her stomach clench. This was the same man who'd been flirting with her an hour ago, all smiles and cowboy swagger. Now he looked at her like she was something to be disposed of, and the transformation was more terrifying than any outright threat. She tried to summon the iron will that had made corporate executives break down and confess their crimes, but all she could think about was how isolated she was. No backup, no support system, no one who even knew exactly where she was. Her phone showed no signal in this storm, and the nearest major city was 3 hours away on roads that were probably washing out even as she sat here. "You're right," she said quietly, and felt a flutter of hope in the room's collective exhale. "This isn't San Francisco. I'm not equipped for this kind of situation." The admission felt like betraying her mother's memory, but it was honest. She was a number cruncher, not a crusader. She'd built her career on following paper trails from the safety of air-conditioned offices, not confronting killers in their hometown while lightning crashed outside. Sheriff Briggs nodded approvingly. "Smart woman. Sometimes the brave thing is knowing when to walk away." But even as she felt herself wavering, another memory surfaced, her mother's voice, weak and frightened in those final hospital days, talking about Dust Devil for the first and last time. "Promise me something, Maggie. Promise me you'll never go back there. Some places, some secrets, they're too hungry. They swallow people whole." Her mother had spent 30 years running from whatever she'd discovered in this town. Now Maggie sat in the heart of that darkness, holding the evidence that could either illumine the truth or get her killed. The storm raged on, and her courage flickered like the unstable lights overhead. The whiskey sat untouched before her as Maggie stared into its amber depths, seeing her mother's reflection in the liquid. The room held its collective breath, waiting for her to choose the safe path back to California, back to Tuesday morning routines and predictable dangers. But her mother's deathbed promise echoed differently now, twisted by new understanding. "Promise me you'll never go back there." Not because there was nothing to find, but because there was too much. Her mother hadn't been protecting Maggie from empty shadows. She'd been protecting her from the very real monsters that had spent decades perfecting the art of making problems disappear. "You know what's funny?" Maggie said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. She picked up the whiskey glass, rolling it between her palms. "I spent my whole career thinking I was hunting white-collar criminals, embezzlers, tax evaders, corporate fraudsters, clean crimes with paper trails and plea bargains." Sheriff Briggs shifted beside her, his weathered hand resting too casually near his service weapon. "Miss Chen, but sitting here tonight, I realized something." She took a small sip, letting the alcohol burn away the last of her comfortable illusions. Those cases were just practice, training wheels for this moment. The admission surprised her with its clarity. Every late night spent unraveling financial conspiracies, every confrontation with desperate executives, every threat from high-powered legal teams. It had all been preparing her for this saloon, this storm, this choice between safety and truth. She thought of the Pemberton Industries case 3 months ago. When their lawyers had cornered her in the parking garage, she'd felt that familiar spike of fear, that voice urging retreat. But she'd gone back to work the next day, dug deeper, and ultimately exposed a $30 million money laundering operation that destroyed 3 careers and sent 2 people to prison. The difference was, back then she'd had the FBI backing her up. Here, the law itself wore Sheriff Briggs' face and carried a gun. "I found something else in my grandfather's files," she said, surprising herself. She hadn't planned to reveal this. Hell, she'd barely processed it herself. But the words emerged with inexorable momentum. A list, names and amounts, dating back to 1956. Payments made to various law enforcement officials, county commissioners, even a state senator. Jake's face drained of color. "You're lying." 47 years of systematic bribery, documented in my grandfather's meticulous handwriting. She met Jake's stare without flinching. "Your father's name appears 63 times. Sheriff Briggs, yours shows up starting in 2006. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Around them, chairs scraped against floorboards as people shifted nervously, but no one spoke, no one denied it. Because it was true, and they all knew it. "The beautiful thing about corruption," Maggie continued, her forensic accountant mind taking over, "is that it always leaves a trail. Always. People can't help themselves. They have to keep records, justify the numbers, balance the books, even when those books document decades of murder and cover-ups." Sheriff Briggs stood slowly, his hand now openly resting on his weapon. "Miss Chen, I think this conversation has gone far enough." But Maggie felt something shifting inside her chest, a familiar sensation she recognized from every major case that had defined her career. The moment when scattered evidence crystallized into undeniable truth. The moment when retreat became impossible because the story demanded telling. "My mother figured it out, didn't she?" The words came faster now, pieces clicking together with horrible logic. "That's why she ran. Not from shame or family drama, but because she discovered what my grandfather was really doing. She found his files and realized she was living in a town run by murderers." Lightning crashed outside, illuminating faces frozen in guilt and fear. In that stark white flash, Maggie saw her own reflection in the mirror behind the bar, pale, determined, and utterly alone. She looked like her mother in those final photographs, the ones taken just months before the accident. "But she made one mistake," Maggie said softly. "She thought running would be enough. She thought 30 years of silence would keep her safe." The room erupted into whispered conversations, fragments of panic and planning that confirmed everything she'd suspected. These people had killed her mother for knowing too much, and now they faced the daughter who knew even more. Standing from her bar stool, Maggie Chen faced the assembled conspirators with something she hadn't felt in years, absolute certainty about her purpose. The comfortable life she'd built in San Francisco suddenly felt like a betrayal of everything her mother had died protecting. "Gentlemen," she said, raising her glass in a mock toast, "my vacation officially starts tomorrow. I've got 2 weeks, 47 years of evidence, and nowhere else I'd rather be." The threshold had been crossed. There was no going back now. The mock toast hung in the air like a death sentence. Maggie set down her glass with deliberate precision, the clink against the wooden bar unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. She had just declared war on an entire town, and the weight of that declaration settled onto her shoulders like a lead blanket. Sheriff Briggs's hand tightened on his weapon. "Miss Chen, you're making a serious mistake." "The first mistake was made in 1947, Maggie replied, pulling her grandfather's leather portfolio from her purse. "When this town decided that covering up the Hendricks murder was easier than seeking justice." The portfolio landed on the bar with a soft thud that might as well have been thunder. Several patrons stepped backward, as if the worn leather contained something contagious. In a way it did. The truth had a way of spreading, contaminating everything it touched. "You want to know the rules of your world, Sheriff? Here they are." She opened the portfolio, revealing photographs, newspaper clippings, and pages of her grandfather's careful handwriting. Rule 1, everything is documented. Rule 2, everyone has a price. Rule 3, anyone who threatens the system disappears. Her phone buzzed against her hip, somehow finding a signal despite the storm. The text was from David. "Weather report shows major storm in your area. Are you somewhere safe?" Safe. The word felt foreign now, like vocabulary from a language she'd forgotten how to speak. She typed back quickly, staying at grandfather's house. "Storm bad, but I'm fine." It wasn't entirely a lie. She was fine, in the sense that she was still breathing. Whether that would remain true depended on how the next few minutes unfolded. "You know what's interesting about corruption networks?" she continued, her voice gaining strength as she fell back into familiar analytical rhythms. "They create natural enemies, people who got cut out of the profits, families who lost someone to the machine, idealists who never learned to keep their mouths shut." Jake stepped closer, his charm completely abandoned. "What's your point?" "My point is that I spent all week thinking I was alone in this. But if I can find 3 generations of evidence in one man's files, imagine what other secrets are hiding in other attics, other safe deposit boxes, other guilty consciences." The realization had hit her during the drive back from the cemetery that afternoon. Dust Devil wasn't just home to conspirators, it was also home to their victims, their rivals, their former allies who'd been betrayed or abandoned. In a town where everyone had secrets, some people might be willing to trade those secrets for revenge. "There's a woman named Rosa Martinez who runs the diner on Main Street," Maggie said, watching faces around the room for recognition. "Her brother Miguel disappeared in 1983. Officially, he left town to find work in California, but my grandfather's notes suggest he was asking too many questions about why certain ranches never seemed to report missing cattle to the sheriff's department." She caught a flicker of nervousness in the bartender's expression. "Got him. Then there's Father Mackenzie at St. Anne's. He arrived in 1979, fresh from seminary, full of ideas about social justice and community outreach. Funny how quickly he learned to keep his sermons focused on salvation rather than earthly justice." A chair scraped in the far corner as someone stood abruptly. Maggie couldn't see who in the dim light, but she heard footsteps heading toward the back exit. "The thing about small towns," she continued, "is that everyone knows everyone else's business, including business they're not supposed to know." Sheriff Briggs stepped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the rain on his jacket and see the calculation behind his eyes. "You're playing a dangerous game with people's lives, Miss Chen, including your own." "My life was forfeit the moment I stepped foot in this saloon," she said, surprised by her own calm. "We both know how this ends if I try to leave quietly. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow night, but eventually." Another single car accident on a dark road. The admission felt like stepping through a door that could never be opened again. She'd acknowledged the rules of their world. Threats were met with violence and witnesses rarely survived their knowledge. But she'd also revealed something else, that she understood the game well enough to change it. "However," she said, pulling out her phone, "I've already uploaded copies of everything to a secure cloud server. 3 different servers, actually, with automated release protocols. If something happens to me, those files go automatically to the FBI, the Nevada State Police, and the Las Vegas Review-Journal. It was a bluff. She'd barely figured out how cloud storage worked, but she delivered it with the confidence of someone who'd spent years making corporate criminals believe their world was crumbling. The storm outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself was waiting to see how this standoff would resolve. In that moment of suspended time, Margaret Chen realized she'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for, the courage her mother had carried in those final, terrifying months. The game was just beginning. The silence stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Maggie could feel the collective weight of 47 years of buried secrets pressing down on the room, and for a moment she wondered if her bluff would hold. Then Jake Morrison's laugh shattered the tension, not the warm chuckle that had charmed her earlier, but something cold and predatory. "You think you're the first person to threaten us with exposure?" He moved closer, crowding her against the bar. "Lady, we've been making problems disappear since before you were born. Cloud servers, FBI contacts, newspaper reporters, we've handled them all." The casual confidence in his voice sent ice through her veins. This wasn't bravado. This was experience speaking. How many others had sat in this same spot, believing their insurance policies would protect them? How many had died anyway? "The Pemberton case," she said suddenly, the memory surfacing unbidden. The whistleblower who provided the original tip, Janet Morrison. She disappeared 3 days after the story broke. Jake's face went perfectly still. "That was my sister." The admission hung between them like a blade. Maggie felt the world tilt sideways as another piece of the puzzle locked into place. She found out about the money laundering operation through family connections. "Through you. Janet always was too smart for her own good," Jake said quietly. "Just like you." Sheriff Briggs cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Gentlemen, I think we need to take this conversation somewhere more private." The words sounded reasonable, professional even, but Maggie had spent enough time with desperate criminals to recognize a death warrant when she heard one. They were going to walk her out of this bar, and she would simply vanish into the storm like so many others before her. Her mother's face flashed before her eyes again. Not the broken woman in the hospital bed, but the young girl in the photographs upstairs, bright, determined, unaware that asking the wrong questions would cost her everything. That girl deserved better than to have her daughter disappear into the same darkness that had claimed her. "Actually," Maggie said, pulling out her phone again, "I think we should stay right here, where there are witnesses." She opened her camera app and began recording, panning across the assembled faces. Margaret Chen, forensic accountant, currently documenting evidence of systematic corruption in Dust Devil, Nevada. Present are Sheriff Thomas Briggs, ranch owner Jake Morrison, and approximately 15 other individuals whose identities will be verified through facial recognition software. "Turn that off," Briggs snapped, reaching for the phone. But Maggie had already hit the live stream button, broadcasting directly to her Facebook account. It was another bluff. She had maybe 3 followers who would care about her sudden interest in Nevada politics, but the red recording light had a magical effect on the room's atmosphere. Everyone watching," she said to the camera with forced brightness. "I'm having such an interesting conversation with the local law enforcement about my grandfather's estate. Sheriff Briggs was just about to explain how the department has handled missing persons cases over the past few decades." The sheriff's face darkened. "This is harassment of a public official." "Is it? Because I'm a private citizen, in a public establishment, asking questions about matters of public record." She kept the phone steady despite her trembling hands. "Unless, of course, there's something about those records you'd prefer to keep private." Jake grabbed her wrist, his grip painful. "Enough games." But as his fingers closed around her arm, the bar's front door crashed open. A figure stumbled inside, shaking rain from a heavy coat. Father Mackenzie from St. Anne's, the priest she'd mentioned earlier. His arrival couldn't have been more perfectly timed if she'd planned it. "Sheriff," the priest called out, then stopped short as he took in the scene. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were conducting business." The older man's eyes found Maggie's phone, still recording, then moved to Jake's grip on her wrist. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition, perhaps, of a moment that could define the rest of his life. "Father Mackenzie," Maggie said clearly, for the benefit of her live-stream audience. Perfect timing. "We were just discussing the spiritual cost of keeping silent about injustice." The priest's weathered face went pale. He stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the war playing out behind his eyes. 45 years of enforced silence, warring against whatever calling had brought him to the ministry in the first place. "Sheriff Briggs," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think it's time we had that conversation we've been avoiding." The room erupted. Voices rose in panic and accusation as 47 years of carefully maintained secrecy began to crack along its foundational lines. Outside, thunder rolled across the desert like the sound of a world ending. Maggie kept recording, knowing she had just lit a fuse that would either illuminate the truth or destroy them all. The chaos that followed Father Mackenzie's declaration was unlike anything Maggie had experienced in 15 years of corporate confrontations. This wasn't the controlled panic of executives facing audit results. This was primal terror, the sound of people watching their entire world collapse in real time. Jake's grip on her wrist tightened to the point of pain. "You have no idea what you've done," he snarled, but his attention was fractured, darting between the live stream and the priest, who had just become a liability after 45 years of reliable silence. "Father, you need to think very carefully about your next words," Sheriff Briggs warned, his voice carrying the weight of decades-old threats. But his authority was cracking. The red recording light on Maggie's phone had transformed their private world into public theater. Father Mackenzie stepped fully into the saloon, water dripping from his coat onto floorboards that had absorbed generations of secrets. In the harsh overhead lighting, he looked every one of his 72 years, but his voice carried an unexpected steel. "I've been thinking for 45 years, Sheriff. Thinking and praying and watching good people disappear." His eyes found Maggie's. "Your mother came to see me, you know. 3 days before the accident. She wanted to make a confession, but not the kind you might expect." The room fell silent, except for the storm's relentless assault on the building's walls. Maggie felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she adjusted the phone's angle to capture both men in frame. Her forensic training screamed at her to document everything, but her human instincts were paralyzed by the magnitude of what was unfolding. She confessed that she'd found evidence of murders, the priest continued, his words falling like stones into still water. She knew the truth about the Hendricks boy, about Miguel Martinez, about the others. She asked me what a mother should do when staying silent means living with evil, but speaking up means leaving her daughter an orphan. Jake released Maggie's wrist abruptly, stepping backward as if burned. The casual confidence he'd worn like armor was evaporating, replaced by something approaching desperation. "You're talking about ancient history, Father. Things that can't be changed." "Murder doesn't have a statute of limitations," Maggie said, her voice steadier than she felt. The live stream viewer count had somehow climbed to 37, probably friends from her accounting firm wondering why she was broadcasting from a Nevada bar at midnight. But 37 witnesses were better than none. "Neither does justice," Father Mackenzie added. He pulled a folded envelope from his coat pocket, yellowed with age. "Your mother gave me this before she left the church that night. Made me promise to keep it safe until someone came asking the right questions." Sheriff Briggs moved toward the priest with predatory intent, but Maggie swung the camera in his direction. "Easy, Sheriff. Remember, we have an audience now." The envelope in Father Mackenzie's hands might as well have been radioactive. Every person in the room understood its implications. 47 years of carefully constructed lies, reduced to whatever evidence Margaret's mother had managed to gather before her death. "She was brilliant," the priest said, addressing Maggie directly. "Figured out patterns that had taken your grandfather decades to document. Financial trails, timing correlations, family connections. She could have been a detective herself if she'd lived in a different world." "What world did she live in instead?" Maggie asked. though she already knew the answer. A world where asking questions gets you killed. Father Mackenzie's words carried the weight of a man who'd been forced to bless too many suspicious graves. A world where good people learn to look away because the alternative is joining the victims. The storm outside reached a crescendo, wind howling through gaps in the building's weathered walls like the voices of the dead demanding acknowledgement. In that moment, Maggie felt the full weight of her inheritance. Not just her grandfather's house and secrets, but her mother's unfinished mission and the legacy of everyone who had died trying to expose the truth. "But that world is ending tonight," she said, surprised by her own certainty. "Because I'm not my mother. I don't have a daughter to protect, and I'm not alone." She gestured toward the phone's screen, where the viewer count had somehow climbed to 64. "Every person watching this stream is a witness. Every word spoken here tonight is being recorded on servers outside your control." Sheriff Briggs pulled out his weapon, not pointing it at anyone yet, but making its presence known. "Miss Chen, you're under arrest for disturbing the peace and harassment of public officials." "On what evidence?" she challenged, her years of courtroom experience finally paying dividends. "I'm in a public establishment, recording public officials who are discussing matters of public interest." But even as she spoke the words, Maggie realized with crystalline clarity that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. These people had killed to protect their secrets for 47 years. Legal technicalities weren't going to save her now. The ordeal she'd been preparing for her entire career was finally beginning. The gun changed everything. The moment Sheriff Briggs drew his weapon, the careful dance of legal technicalities and recorded evidence collapsed into something far more primitive. Maggie watched her livestream viewer count spike to 93 as the camera captured the sheriff's service pistol, its black metal gleaming under the saloon's harsh lights. But those 93 witnesses might as well have been watching from another planet for all the protection they could offer. "Turn off the phone, Miss Chen," Briggs said with deadly calm. "Now." Her finger hovered over the screen. Everything she'd built, the evidence, the witnesses, the momentum toward justice, balanced on this single moment. But as she looked into the sheriff's eyes, she saw 47 years of practiced violence. This wasn't a man who would hesitate to add another body to Dust Devil's collection of convenient accidents. "The viewers will notice if the stream cuts out," she said, hating how her voice wavered. "They'll notice a lot more if they watch you get shot resisting arrest." Father Mackenzie stepped forward, the yellowed envelope still clutched in his trembling hands. "Sheriff, in the name of everything holy—" "Sit down, Father." Briggs didn't even look at the priest. "You've done enough damage for one night." The old man's face crumpled as if he'd been struck. 45 years of accumulated guilt and shame seemed to collapse inward, leaving him looking small and broken. He sank into the nearest chair, the envelope falling from his nerveless fingers to the beer-stained floor. Maggie felt something vital shatter inside her chest as she watched her only ally surrender. The priest had carried her mother's final evidence for decades, waiting for this moment, but when faced with real consequences, his courage evaporated like morning mist. "Pick it up," Jake ordered, gesturing toward the envelope. When neither Maggie nor the priest moved, he retrieved it himself, tearing open the seal with violent efficiency. The papers inside, photocopied bank records, handwritten notes, what looked like pages from her grandfather's journals, scattered across the floor as Jake examined them. His expression grew darker with each document he recognized. "Your mother really was thorough," he said with grudging admiration. "Financial records going back to 1977, correlation charts, even some of the sheriff department's burial reports that mysteriously went missing from official files." He looked up at Maggie with something approaching respect. She could have destroyed us all. Could have, but didn't. Sheriff Briggs holstered his weapon, apparently deciding the immediate threat had passed. "Just like you won't." The casual certainty in his voice sent ice through Maggie's veins. She realized with horrible clarity that they weren't going to kill her here, in front of witnesses and live-stream cameras. They were going to let her walk out of this bar, let her drive back to her grandfather's house, let her believe she'd escaped. Then they would come for her in the darkness, when there were no cameras or crowds to complicate the narrative. Another single car accident on a rain-slicked road, a tragic end to a city woman who'd never learned to drive in rural conditions. "The cloud servers," she said desperately. "If something happens to me—" "There are no cloud servers," Jake interrupted with cruel amusement. "You're a forensic accountant, not a computer expert. You can barely figure out how live streaming works, let alone set up automated data releases." He was right, and they all knew it. Her technological bluffs had bought her time, nothing more. The evidence that could destroy Dust Devil's power structure was scattered on a barroom floor, and the only people who knew its significance were the same people who would benefit from its destruction. Her phone buzzed with incoming comments from the live stream. "What's happening? Are you okay? Should we call someone?" But her San Francisco friends might as well have been watching a movie for all the help they could provide. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, she would be another mysterious disappearance, another cautionary tale about outsiders who ask too many questions. The storm outside was beginning to weaken, its fury spent. Soon the roads would be passable again. Soon she would have no excuse to remain in the safety of public spaces. Father Mackenzie raised his head, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though Maggie couldn't tell if he was addressing her, her mother's memory, or the God who had apparently abandoned them all. Sheriff Briggs began methodically collecting the scattered papers, feeding them one by one into the saloon's old wood-burning stove. 47 years of evidence reduced to ash and smoke, rising up the chimney to disappear into the Nevada night. As she watched her mother's final gift to justice literally go up in flames, Margaret Chen understood with perfect clarity that she was about to die for the same truths that had killed everyone before her. All her careful planning, all her evidence, all her courage, none of it had been enough. Evil, it seemed, was simply better at survival than justice was at flourishing. The game was over, and she had lost. But as the last document curled into ash, Maggie felt something shift inside her, not defeat, but a strange, crystalline clarity she'd never experienced before. Watching her mother's evidence burn should have broken her, but instead it stripped away every last illusion about the nature of the fight she was in. "You think you've won?" she said quietly, her voice cutting through the crackling of flames. The words surprised her with their steadiness. "But you're making the same mistake everyone before you made." Sheriff Briggs paused, another paper halfway to the fire. "What mistake is that, Miss Chen?" "You think this is about evidence." She looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes that had been avoiding hers. "You think it's about documents and proof and building legal cases. But that was never what this was about." Jake's confident smirk faltered slightly. "Then what?" "It's about fear." Maggie gestured toward her phone, where the viewer count now showed 127 people watching in real time. "Look at yourselves. Look at this room. You have the sheriff, the most powerful rancher in 3 counties, half the town council, and God knows who else. You have all the evidence destroyed, all the witnesses silenced, all the power that money and violence can buy. But you're terrified of one woman with a cell phone. The truth of it hung in the air like smoke from the burning papers. She could see it in their faces, the recognition that for all their careful planning and decades of control, they were operating from a position of fundamental weakness. "You're afraid because you know what you've built here can't survive daylight," she continued, surprised by the power in her own voice. "Your entire system depends on people being too isolated, too scared, too hopeless to believe change is possible. But I'm not isolated anymore. Every person watching this stream is connected to other people in other places who have resources you can't touch and jurisdiction you can't control." Father Mackenzie looked up from his chair, something flickering in his tear-stained eyes that might have been hope. "Even if you kill me tonight," Maggie said, "you've already lost. Because 127 people have watched you threaten a forensic accountant for asking questions about public records. They've seen a priest try to come forward with evidence, only to be silenced by the very officials who should be investigating. They've watched you burn documents rather than allow scrutiny. She could feel the momentum shifting, like a massive stone balanced on a cliff's edge finally beginning to tip. The live stream comments were changing tone. Her San Francisco colleagues were no longer asking casual questions, but expressing genuine alarm, promising to make calls, to contact authorities outside Nevada's borders. "The FBI has field offices in Las Vegas," she said conversationally. "The State Attorney General's office has a corruption task force. The Nevada Gaming Commission takes a very dim view of money laundering operations that could jeopardize casino licenses. All of those agencies will be getting calls tomorrow morning from very concerned citizens who watched a live stream of local officials destroying evidence and threatening witnesses." Sheriff Briggs's face had gone pale. "Those agencies won't what? Investigate credible reports of corruption? Won't follow up on evidence of systematic cover-ups spanning decades?" Maggie shook her head. "You've been isolated here so long you've forgotten how the outside world works. Federal agencies love cases like this, career-making prosecutions with clear villains and sympathetic victims." Jake grabbed her phone, but it was too late. The damage was done. The stream had been running for over an hour, recording everything. Even if he destroyed the device, the footage was already archived on Facebook's servers, backed up in data centers across the country, viewed by people whose names he didn't know in places he couldn't reach. "You destroyed my mother's evidence," Maggie said as Jake fumbled with the phone's controls. "But you did it on camera, in front of witnesses, while threatening the person who brought it forward. You've just created better evidence than anything she could have gathered 47 years ago." The silence that followed was different from the terrorized quiet that had gripped the room earlier. This was the silence of people realizing they had miscalculated catastrophically, that their methods for dealing with isolated victims had backfired spectacularly when applied to someone connected to the wider world. Father Mackenzie stood slowly, his tears replaced by something approaching wonder. "She's right," he whispered. "Dear God, she's actually right." As the words sank in, Maggie felt the final piece of understanding click into place. Her grandfather's journals, her mother's investigation, even her own arrival in Dust Devil, none of it had been about gathering enough evidence to bring down the conspiracy. It had been about waiting for the right moment, when the tools existed to break through decades of enforced isolation. The internet, social media, live streaming technology, her generation took these things for granted, but they represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power between small-town corruption and outside accountability. For the first time in Dust Devil's history, the truth couldn't be contained within the town's borders. She had won, not through superior planning or evidence, but by recognizing that the game itself had changed. The revelation hung in the air like the smoke from the burned documents, and Maggie watched as its implications rippled through the room. Jake's hands shook as he stared at her phone, the device now useless to him but somehow still radiating the power of connection to the outside world. Sheriff Briggs had gone completely still, his face cycling through expressions as he calculated the scope of their exposure. But it was Father Mackenzie who moved first. The priest straightened his shoulders with visible effort, decades of guilt and fear seeming to fall away like an old coat. "There's more," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Evidence they can't burn because they don't know where it is." Maggie's heart lurched. "What do you mean?" "Your mother was clever, cleverer than any of us gave her credit for." The priest reached into his jacket again, this time producing a small brass key. "She didn't just make copies, she hid originals. Bank deposit boxes, attorney safe houses, people who owed her favors in other cities. What you saw burned tonight was just what she kept local, in case something happened to her before she could return for the rest." The color drained from Jake's face. "That's impossible. We searched." "You searched what you could reach," Father Mackenzie interrupted with newfound authority. But your mother was a forensic accountant, Miss Chen. She understood evidence chains, backup systems, geographic distribution. She spent 3 months setting up a network you people could never untangle, all triggered by specific conditions. Maggie felt pieces clicking into place. "The birthday card," she whispered. "The one my mother sent right before she died. It had a safety deposit box key taped inside the envelope. Among other things, I imagine." The priest's smile was sad but genuine. "She told me there would be signs, ways for someone with the right knowledge to follow the trail she'd laid. Your arrival here, asking the right questions, knowing details only family could know, it was all part of her plan." Sheriff Briggs stepped forward menacingly, but the gesture felt hollow now. "Father, you're making a serious mistake." "I've been making mistakes for 47 years, the priest shot back with surprising steel. "Tonight, for the first time since your father killed Miguel Martinez, I'm finally doing something right." The admission hit the room like a physical blow. Even through her shock, Maggie noticed how the statement registered on Jake's face. Not surprise, but resignation. He'd known. They'd all known, all these decades, exactly who had killed whom and why. "Mr. Morrison," she said, turning to face Jake directly, "your father didn't just cover up murders, he committed them." Jake's jaw worked silently for a moment before he found his voice. "Ancient history," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Everyone involved is dead, except everyone who inherited their profits." Maggie felt her training taking over, the patterns and connections that made her excel at forensic accounting suddenly applicable to something far more significant than embezzled pension funds. That's what this has always been about, isn't it? Not just covering up old crimes, but protecting the wealth those crimes generated. She looked around the room, seeing the powerful families of Dust Devil with new eyes. How much land changed hands after convenient disappearances? How many mining claims were abandoned when their owners had sudden accidents? How much of this town's prosperity is built on murder? "You can't prove any of that," Sheriff Briggs said, but his voice carried the desperate edge of a man watching his world crumble. "I don't have to prove it yet," Maggie replied. "I just have to point federal investigators in the right direction and let them do what they do best. Follow the money, trace the ownership histories, correlate the timing with my grandfather's journals, the kind of systematic analysis that takes time but always produces results." She pulled out her backup phone, a precaution that drew sharp looks from both men, and began typing rapidly. "I'm sending emails to every contact I have in federal law enforcement, corporate investigation, and financial crimes. I'm copying the State Attorney General, the FBI field office, and 3 different news organizations that specialize in long-form investigative pieces." "You're making enemies of very dangerous people," Jake said quietly. "I'm making allies of more dangerous people," she countered. "Federal prosecutors love cases with clear evidence chains and multiple victims. Media outlets love stories about corrupt small towns and generational cover-ups. And my colleagues love the challenge of untangling complex financial crimes that span decades." For the first time since entering the Broken Spur, Maggie felt truly confident. The fear was still there, but it was overwhelmed by something she recognized from her most successful investigations, the momentum that comes when scattered pieces suddenly form a clear picture. Father Mackenzie walked to her side, no longer the broken man who had cowered in his chair. "What do you need from me?" "Everything you know," she said simply. "Names, dates, locations. It doesn't have to be perfect, just enough to give investigators starting points." As the priest began to speak, recounting 47 years of suppressed truth, Maggie realized her grandfather would have been proud. She had finally learned to use her greatest weapon, not evidence or courage, but the simple power of connection to something larger than Dust Devil's carefully constructed isolation. The game had indeed changed, and this time, justice had better allies. The priest's voice grew steadier with each revelation, 47 years of buried secrets spilling out like water through a broken dam. Names, dates, property transfers that coincided with disappearances, a litany of corruption that made Maggie's fingers fly across her phone's keyboard as she documented everything for the investigators who would soon descend on Dust Devil like avenging angels. But, as Father Mackenzie spoke, she noticed the subtle shift in Jake's demeanor. The panic was fading, replaced by something far more dangerous, cold calculation. His eyes moved between the exits, the remaining patrons, the priest whose testimony could destroy everything the Morrison family had built. "That's enough," Jake said quietly, his hand moving toward his jacket. "No." The word came out stronger than Maggie had intended, filled with an authority she didn't know she possessed. "It's not nearly enough. This is just the beginning." She looked around the room, addressing not just Jake and the sheriff, but everyone who had been watching in silence. "You're all thinking about damage control, about how to minimize what comes next, but you're still not understanding the fundamental shift that's happened here tonight." Her phone buzzed with responses to her emails. Colleagues in San Francisco promising immediate action, contacts in federal agencies acknowledging receipt of her evidence summaries, journalists expressing intense interest in the story she'd outlined. The outside world was already mobilizing. For 70 years, this town operated on a simple principle: keep secrets local, handle problems internally, present a united front to outsiders. It worked because communication was limited, because investigations were easy to redirect, because people like my mother could be isolated and eliminated before they could build effective networks. She held up her phone, showing the flood of incoming messages. "That world doesn't exist anymore. In the next 12 hours, this story will be in the hands of federal prosecutors in 3 states, investigative journalists at 5 major publications, and forensic accounting firms that specialize in exactly this kind of systematic fraud. The isolation you've depended on is gone forever." Sheriff Briggs made one last attempt at intimidation. "Miss Chen, you're making accusations you can't substantiate." "I don't need to substantiate them," she interrupted. "I just need to provide enough credible evidence to justify federal intervention, which I've already done. The FBI doesn't need permission from local authorities to investigate interstate financial crimes. The IRS doesn't need cooperation from county sheriffs to audit suspicious property transfers. The state attorney general doesn't need approval from small-town power brokers to convene grand juries." The truth of it was sinking in throughout the room. She could see it in their faces, the recognition that their carefully maintained control was about to be challenged by forces they couldn't threaten, bribe, or eliminate. Father Mackenzie stepped closer to her side, his voice gaining strength as he continued his recitation of buried crimes. "The Hartwell mine collapse in 1981, that wasn't an accident. The Morrison family needed the mineral rights, and the Hartwells wouldn't sell. 3 men died when the support timbers were sabotaged." "Jesus Christ, Father," someone whispered from the back of the room. "Don't take the Lord's name in vain," the priest replied with grim humor. "Not when I'm finally doing his work after decades of serving earthly masters." Maggie's phone rang, a number she recognized from the FBI's San Francisco field office. News of her situation was already climbing the federal food chain, triggering protocols designed to protect witnesses and preserve evidence in corruption cases. "I need to take this," she said, answering the call on speaker so everyone could hear. "Miss Chen, this is Agent Rodriguez with the Bureau's White-Collar Crime Division. We've received your preliminary evidence package and testimony footage. Are you currently in a safe location?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Every eye in the room was on her, waiting to see how she would answer, what level of protection she would claim or need. "I'm in the Broken Spur Saloon in Dust Devil, Nevada," she said clearly. "I'm surrounded by several individuals who have made explicit and implicit threats related to my investigation into financial crimes and potential homicides spanning multiple decades. I need immediate federal protection and a secure location to provide full testimony." "Understood. We're coordinating with Las Vegas field office and state police. Federal agents are en route to your location. Do not leave the public space you're currently in. Maintain communication with this number." As she ended the call, Maggie looked around the room one final time. The game wasn't just changing, it was over. Federal intervention was now a certainty. Protection was on the way, and the evidence network her mother had so carefully constructed was about to be fully activated. "The road back," she said softly, thinking of her grandfather's journals and her mother's sacrifice. "Sometimes it takes 3 generations to find it, but justice always finds a way home." Outside, she could hear the distant sound of helicopters approaching through the storm. The helicopter rotors grew louder, cutting through the storm's fury with mechanical precision that sent vibrations through the saloon's weathered walls. But instead of the relief Maggie expected to feel, a new tension seized her chest as she watched Jake Morrison's face transform from resignation to something far more dangerous, the cornered desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. "Federal agents," she said loudly, hoping her voice would carry to everyone in the room. "They'll be here in minutes." Jake's hand moved inside his jacket with deliberate slowness. "Minutes is a long time, Miss Chen. Long enough for things to go very wrong for someone who's caused this much trouble." The ultimate test had arrived, and Maggie realized with crystalline clarity that all her preparation, her mother's evidence, her grandfather's journals, her live-streamed revelations, meant nothing if she couldn't survive the next few minutes. Everything she'd learned about Dust Devil's corruption, about generational secrets and buried crimes, had led to this moment when raw violence would try one last time to silence the truth. "You're thinking like your father," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Solve problems with threats and violence. But that's exactly what brought federal attention here in the first place. My father protected this town." Jake snarled, his hand now clearly gripping something metallic inside his jacket. "Protected families, protected livelihoods. You're going to destroy everything good people have built here." Father Mackenzie stepped between them, his newfound courage blazing like a shield. "Good people don't build their lives on murdered bodies, Jake. Good people don't spend decades covering up crimes that cry out to heaven for justice." The helicopter sound was closer now, accompanied by the distant wail of sirens converging on Dust Devil through the storm. But Maggie could see the calculation in Jake's eyes. He was measuring time, weighing his chances of eliminating the primary witness before federal protection arrived. This was her final test. Could she use everything she'd learned to survive the next crucial minutes? "Sheriff Briggs," she called out, never taking her eyes off Jake. "You've spent your career making pragmatic choices. Here's the most important one you'll ever make. In approximately 90 seconds, federal agents are going to enter this building. What they find will determine whether you're viewed as a cooperative witness or a co-conspirator in whatever happens next." She could see the sheriff wrestling with the mathematics of survival, his loyalty to the Morrison family warring with his instinct for self-preservation. "Jake, put your hands where I can see them," she continued, drawing on every technique she'd learned for staying calm under pressure. "Whatever you're thinking of doing, it won't work. There are too many witnesses, too many people watching. You'll just be adding federal charges to everything else." But Jake's face showed the glazed determination of a man who'd moved beyond rational calculation. His father's son to the end, believing violence could solve what negotiation couldn't. "My family has run this town for 3 generations, he said, his voice carrying an eerie calm. "We've protected it from outside interference, kept it stable, kept it prosperous. I won't let one bitter woman with a grudge destroy everything we've built." The helicopter was directly overhead now, its searchlight cutting through the storm to illuminate the saloon's windows. But Jake was no longer looking toward the sound. His attention was fixed entirely on Maggie, his hand emerging from his jacket with deliberate purpose. This was the moment when everything she'd learned converged, her understanding of corruption and cover-ups, her insights into generational trauma and buried guilt, her recognition that isolation bred violence while connection bred accountability. More than that, this was when she had to trust that the network she'd activated, the federal agents, the journalists, the colleagues watching from afar, would hold firm even if she didn't survive to see justice done. "Father Mackenzie," she said quietly, "keep talking. Tell them about the Hartwell mine. Tell them about Miguel Martinez. Tell them about every crime you've watched them cover up. Make sure the agents hear everything when they come through that door." The priest nodded, understanding that he might be the only witness left to carry the story forward. Jake's weapon was almost clear of his jacket when the saloon doors burst open with explosive force, federal agents in tactical gear flooding the space with professional efficiency that transformed chaos into controlled order within seconds. Federal agents, hands visible, nobody move. The storm outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself recognized that the long reckoning had finally arrived in Dust Devil, Nevada. Maggie stood perfectly still, her hands raised, watching as 3 generations of buried secrets were about to be dragged into the light by forces that couldn't be intimidated, bought, or eliminated. Her final test wasn't just about survival, it was about trust. Trust that justice could prevail when enough people refused to look away. The helicopters circled overhead like mechanical angels, and Margaret Chen finally understood what her grandfather had meant when he wrote about the long road back to righteousness. The tactical lights cut through the saloon's dim atmosphere like surgical instruments, and in that blazing illumination, Maggie watched Jake Morrison make the choice that would define his legacy. His hand froze on the grip of his weapon as red laser dots danced across his chest. Professional marksman who wouldn't hesitate if he moved another inch. "Drop the weapon, now!" The lead agent's voice carried absolute authority, the kind that came from years of confronting desperate men in impossible situations. But Jake wasn't looking at the agents. His eyes remained locked on Maggie with the intensity of a man watching his entire world collapse. In that stare, she saw 3 generations of Morrison arrogance, the bone-deep belief that their family was above consequences, that their power in Dust Devil made them untouchable by outside forces. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, his voice barely audible over the agent's shouted commands. "The jobs you've destroyed, the families you've ruined. This town was good before you came here." "This town was built on murder," Maggie replied, her voice carrying across the frozen tableau. She kept her hands visible, her movements deliberate, but she wouldn't let his final moments of power go unchallenged. Every dollar of prosperity, every comfortable life, every generation that got to grow up safe, it all came from crimes your family committed and covered up. The weapon in Jake's hand trembled, not from fear, but from rage so pure it seemed to burn the air around him. "My great-grandfather built something from nothing. My grandfather protected it. My father expanded it. We gave this town stability, prosperity, purpose. Built on whose bones?" Father Mackenzie stepped forward, his voice ringing with decades of suppressed truth. "Miguel Martinez's bones? Sarah Chen's bones? How many others we never found?" Sheriff Briggs had his hands raised, his face showing the sick recognition of a man watching his carefully constructed world disintegrate. The other patrons pressed against the walls, witnesses to a confrontation that would be dissected in courtrooms for years to come. Last warning, the lead agent's finger was on his trigger, professional patience wearing thin. "Drop the weapon or we drop you!" Maggie saw the exact moment when Jake Morrison accepted that his family's 70-year reign was over. The calculation that had kept him dangerous shifted into something else, the bitter acknowledgement that even if he killed her now, even if he eliminated the primary witness, the network she'd activated would continue without her. The federal agents weren't alone. Behind them, Maggie could see Nevada State Police, crime scene technicians, federal prosecutors who'd driven through the storm because the evidence she'd transmitted was too compelling to wait for morning. The outside world hadn't just arrived in Dust Devil, it had come in overwhelming force. "You want to know the real joke?" Jake's laugh was harsh, bitter. "We actually thought about buying you off when you first arrived. $1 million to walk away, forget whatever you'd found. Would have been the cheapest solution we ever implemented." "But you couldn't help yourselves," Maggie said, understanding flooding through her. "You had to intimidate first, had to try breaking me before offering the carrot. Your father's methods, even when they didn't make sense anymore. Jake's grip on the weapon shifted, and every agent in the room tensed. But instead of raising it toward Maggie, he stared down at the gun as if seeing it clearly for the first time, seeing what it represented, what it made him. 4 generations, he whispered. 4 generations of my family, and it ends with me holding a gun on an accountant while federal agents surround me in the same bar where my great-grandfather used to drink with the men he murdered. The profound sadness in his voice made Maggie's chest tighten. Despite everything, the threats, the violence, the decades of cover-ups, she could see the human cost of inherited corruption. Jake Morrison had never chosen his family's path. He'd simply been born into it, raised to believe that power justified everything, that loyalty to family trumped loyalty to justice. "It doesn't have to end with more violence," she said softly. "Your family's story doesn't have to end the way it began." For a heartbeat that felt like eternity, Jake Morrison stood at the crossroads of his family's legacy. The weapon in his hand represented 70 years of choosing violence over accountability, intimidation over justice, family loyalty over moral clarity. Then, with movements so slow they seemed choreographed, he placed the gun on the nearest table and raised his hands in surrender. The federal agents moved with practiced precision, securing the weapon and placing Jake in restraints while reading him his rights. But Maggie barely heard the familiar words. She was watching Jake's face as the handcuffs clicked into place, seeing something she hadn't expected: relief. The confrontation was over. 3 generations of buried secrets were about to face the light, and for the first time in 70 years, justice had come to Dust Devil, Nevada. The relief on Jake Morrison's face lasted exactly 3 seconds before Agent Rodriguez turned toward her, his expression grave with the weight of federal responsibility. "Ms. Chen, we need to discuss immediate relocation. Your safety is now a federal priority." The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. She'd known this moment would come, had prepared for it intellectually, but hearing it spoken aloud made the sacrifice real in ways her planning couldn't capture. Relocation, new identity, witness protection, the complete severing of the life she'd built in San Francisco. "For how long?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Potentially permanent," Rodriguez said gently. "The corruption network you've exposed extends beyond Dust Devil. We're looking at interstate organized crime, federal tax evasion, racketeering charges that could take years to prosecute. Multiple families, multiple jurisdictions. The threats against you won't end with tonight's arrests." Maggie's phone buzzed with a text from her law firm's managing partner, Margaret. "The news is already breaking. Federal raids in Nevada, your name connected. We need to discuss your status immediately." Her career, her reputation, her carefully constructed professional identity, all of it would be consumed by this story. Even if she survived the trials, even if she could eventually surface with a new identity. Margaret Chen, the forensic accountant, was finished. The woman who'd spent 20 years building credibility, developing client relationships, creating a life of precise intellectual challenges and predictable professional rewards. That person was already dead. "My practice," she said, the words coming out smaller than she intended. "My clients, my cases, my apartment, everything." Agent Rodriguez nodded with the sympathy of someone who'd guided other witnesses through this particular loss. "The Bureau has programs to help with financial transition. We can arrange for your affairs to be settled discreetly. But yes, your current life ends tonight." Sheriff Briggs, now also in handcuffs, looked at her with something approaching pity. "Was it worth it? Destroying your whole life to dig up old bones?" Maggie thought of her mother's evidence, hidden for decades because Sarah Chen had no way to safely reveal what she'd discovered. Her grandfather's journals, filled with the careful documentation of a man who'd seen too much but had no power to act. 3 generations of women who'd carried pieces of the truth, each one isolated, each one forced to choose between justice and survival. "My life was already destroyed," she said quietly. "I just didn't know it yet. Every day I didn't know how my mother really died. Every year I believed the lies about my grandfather. That wasn't really living." That was just existing in someone else's version of reality. Father Mackenzie approached slowly, his hands still visible to the agents. "Margaret, there's something else you need to know, about the cost of what you've done tonight." She looked at him, seeing fresh pain in his eyes. "This town will die," he said simply. "Not immediately, but inevitably. The Morrison family controlled 60% of the local economy. The other families you've exposed control most of the rest. When the prosecutions begin, when the assets are frozen and the businesses shut down for investigation, Dust Devil will become a ghost town." The weight of it settled on her shoulders like lead. Innocent families who'd benefited from corrupt prosperity without knowing its true source. Children who'd grown up here, elderly residents who'd never lived anywhere else, small business owners whose only crime was serving customers whose money came from buried crimes. 300 people, Father Mackenzie continued. "Maybe 50 will stay when the federal investigation is complete. The rest will lose everything: homes, businesses, community ties built over generations. The children will have to start over somewhere else. The elderly may not survive the displacement." Agent Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we need to move. The storm's clearing and we have a helicopter standing by." Maggie looked around the Broken Spur saloon one final time, seeing it as both a crime scene and a community gathering place that would probably close forever within months. The bartender who'd served her that first night was pressed against the wall, his face showing the sick recognition of a man watching his livelihood evaporate. The other patrons, some complicit in the cover-ups, others simply trapped by geography and circumstance, all faced an uncertain future because of the choice she'd made to pursue truth over stability. Her phone rang again. Another colleague, another professional relationship that would need to be severed. The digital life she'd spent years cultivating would have to be abandoned, every connection carefully cut to protect both herself and others from association with a federal witness. The helicopter's rotors were spinning up outside, drowning out the storm's fading fury with mechanical purpose. Time to go, time to become someone else, somewhere else, carrying the knowledge that justice sometimes required the complete destruction of everything familiar. As Agent Rodriguez guided her toward the door, Maggie whispered a silent goodbye to Margaret Chen, forensic accountant of San Francisco. That woman's work was done. The sacrifice was complete, and the price of justice was everything she'd ever been. The helicopter lifted off, just as dawn broke over Dust Devil, and Maggie watched through the small window as the town shrank to miniature below her. A collection of buildings that looked almost innocent in the morning light, like a child's toy frontier settlement, rather than the nexus of 70 years of buried crimes. Agent Rodriguez handed her a secure phone. "Your handler will call within the hour. There's a safe house in Phoenix where you'll stay during initial debriefing. After that, we'll discuss long-term placement options." Long-term placement. The clinical language made it sound like a business transaction rather than the complete erasure of her identity. Maggie turned the phone over in her hands, its weight heavier than any device she'd ever held. This would be her only connection to the outside world for the foreseeable future, monitored and controlled by people whose job was to keep her alive but hidden. "The prosecutions will take 18 months minimum," Rodriguez continued, consulting a tablet. "Multiple jurisdictions, complex evidence chains, witness coordination. You'll testify by video link for most proceedings, but there may be key hearings that require your physical presence. What happens to Jake Morrison? Federal racketeering charges, conspiracy, accessory to murder. He's looking at life without parole if convicted. His cooperation could reduce the sentence, but given what you've uncovered, he doesn't have much to bargain with that we don't already know." Maggie nodded, surprised by the hollowness where satisfaction should have been. Jake Morrison would face justice, but she found herself thinking about the man who stood in that saloon with relief on his face as the handcuffs clicked into place. 4 generations of inherited guilt, finally ended by someone brave enough or desperate enough to refuse the family tradition. Her phone buzzed with a final message from her assistant back in San Francisco. "All client files secured. Office lease terminated as requested. Your personal effects are in storage. Take care of yourself, Margaret." Even her assistant didn't know she'd never be back. The cover story would be a family emergency requiring extended absence, then gradual transition to personal leave for health reasons, then, eventually, the quiet closure of her practice. Margaret Chen would simply fade away, leaving behind tax returns and case files and professional relationships that would slowly forget she'd ever existed. The helicopter banked east, carrying her toward a new identity that hadn't been created yet. In 3 days, she would meet the federal specialists who would help her construct a plausible background, complete with credit history and employment records and all the digital fingerprints of a person who'd never been to Nevada, never heard of Dust Devil, never learned her grandfather's real name. "Agent Rodriguez," she said. "What happens to Father Mackenzie?" "He'll testify, but he's not entering protection. Says he won't abandon his congregation during the transition. We've offered security, but he's declined, claims God will protect him." Rodriguez shook his head. "Brave man, but not necessarily a smart one." Through the window, Maggie could see the highway leading out of Dust Devil, already busy with government vehicles heading toward the crime scenes she'd identified. State forensics teams would spend months excavating the old mine where her mother died. Federal accountants would dissect 70 years of financial records. Historians would piece together the true story of a town built on murder and sustained by silence. Her grandfather's journals would become evidence exhibits, his careful documentation of buried secrets transformed into government files. The man she'd never really known would finally receive recognition for his courage, though he'd been dead 20 years and couldn't appreciate the vindication. "Miss Chen," Rodriguez said gently, "I want you to know, what you did took extraordinary courage. Most people in your situation would have walked away, taken the buy-off, let sleeping dogs lie. You chose justice even when it cost everything." Maggie thought about that word, courage. It felt too noble for what she'd actually experienced. She hadn't felt brave in that saloon, facing down Jake Morrison and 3 generations of buried guilt. She'd felt terrified, desperate, and utterly alone. The courage, if that's what it was, had come from understanding that some truths were too important to leave buried, regardless of personal cost. Her mother had tried to expose these crimes and died for it. Her grandfather had documented them, but lacked the power to act. She'd been the 3rd generation with pieces of the puzzle, but the first with the connections and credibility to make the outside world listen. The helicopter crossed into Arizona airspace, and Maggie Chen, the woman who'd lived 42 years in San Francisco, who'd built a reputation as one of the city's most meticulous forensic accountants, who'd had an apartment overlooking the bay and a practice that demanded nothing more dangerous than analyzing financial irregularities, began the process of becoming someone else entirely. Justice had been served, but the price was everything she'd ever been. The helicopter touched down at Phoenix Sky Harbor just as the city began its evening rush hour, and Maggie found herself staring through bulletproof glass at a world that looked impossibly normal. Commuters hurried toward terminals. Families embraced returning travelers. Business people checked phones with the casual urgency of lives built on predictable schedules. She remembered being one of those people, someone whose biggest concern was whether her flight would be delayed, whether she'd make it home in time for dinner reservations she'd actually keep. 6 months later, she sat in a coffee shop in Portland, Oregon, watching rain streak down windows as strangers lived their ordinary lives around her. The name on her driver's license read Michelle Weber. The woman in the mirror had shorter hair, different glasses, and a wariness in her eyes that Margaret Chen had never possessed. But sometimes, when she caught her reflection unexpectedly, she still looked for the person she used to be. The federal trials had concluded 3 weeks ago. Jake Morrison received life without parole. Sheriff Briggs got 25 years. 12 other defendants received sentences ranging from 10 years to life, their fates determined by the careful documentation her grandfather had hidden in his basement walls. Father Mackenzie had testified via video link, looking older but somehow lighter, as if the truth had physically lifted decades of weight from his shoulders. Dust Devil was indeed dying, exactly as the priest had predicted. The last newspaper report she'd seen, delivered through her handler's careful channels, described a town of 43 residents and falling. The Broken Spur Saloon had closed permanently. The Morrison Ranch was now federal property, pending seizure proceedings. Most of the families had simply packed up and left, abandoning mortgages on homes that would never sell, walking away from lives built on foundations they'd never questioned. Her phone buzzed, not the secure federal device, but the ordinary smartphone that Michelle Weber carried. A text from the art gallery where she now worked part-time, handling their books with the same precision Margaret Chen had once applied to corporate fraud cases. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was still a forensic accountant, just with different crimes to uncover, and a name that belonged to someone she was still learning to become. "Michelle, can you cover Saturday's opening? The new exhibition is getting great press. Lisa." She typed back her acceptance, fingers moving automatically while her mind processed the strangeness of having colleagues who knew nothing about Nevada, nothing about buried murders or inherited corruption. To Lisa and the other gallery staff, Michelle was simply a quiet woman from back east who'd moved to Portland for a fresh start after a difficult divorce. The cover story was mundane enough to be invisible, tragic enough to explain her occasional distant moments without inviting deeper questions. The coffee shop door opened with a soft chime, and Agent Rodriguez walked in, looking like any other businessman grabbing afternoon caffeine. Their monthly check-ins were always staged this way, casual encounters in public spaces where two strangers might briefly share a table. He ordered black coffee and a pastry, then approached her corner booth with the careful diffidence of someone asking to share space during the afternoon rush. "Mind if I sit? Everywhere else is taken." She nodded, closing the book she'd been pretending to read. The history of the American West. She'd been drawn to it without quite understanding why, searching its pages for context that might help her process what she'd uncovered in Dust Devil. "How are you adjusting?" Rodriguez asked quietly, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Some days I forget who I'm supposed to be," she admitted. "Yesterday I almost introduced myself as Margaret to a customer, caught myself just in time." "That's normal. It takes most people 8 to 12 months to fully settle into their new identity. You're ahead of the curve, actually." She thought about what settling in meant. Michelle Weber had a small apartment near the gallery, a routine that involved morning walks and evening reading, a life that was peaceful and predictable and utterly solitary. Margaret Chen had been alone too, but it was the chosen solitude of someone busy enough to mistake isolation for independence. Michelle's aloneness felt different, the enforced distance of someone who could never risk real intimacy again. "Any regrets?" Rodriguez asked, the question he always posed during these meetings. Maggie, Michelle, considered it seriously, as she had every month for half a year. The answer was more complex than yes or no. She regretted the necessity of what she'd done, regretted that justice had required such complete destruction. She mourned Margaret Chen's life, missed the professional challenges and intellectual satisfaction of her old career. She grieved for Dust Devil's innocent casualties, the children who'd been uprooted and the elderly who died in unfamiliar places. But she didn't regret choosing truth over comfortable lies. "No," she said finally, "no regrets about the choice itself, only about the world that made such a choice necessary." Rodriguez finished his coffee and stood, leaving a business card on the table, his cover identity as a software consultant. "Same time next month. Call if you need anything before then." Michelle Weber watched him leave, then returned to her book about the American West, reading about frontier justice and the complex relationship between law and survival. Outside, Portland's evening rain continued, washing the streets clean while she sat in warmth and safety, forever changed by her journey into a town that no longer existed, carrying secrets that had finally found their proper place in the light. The book slipped from Michelle's hands as she dozed in the coffee shop's corner booth, the warmth and white noise of ordinary life lulling her into the first peaceful sleep she'd managed in weeks. When she startled awake an hour later, the rain had stopped, and golden afternoon light streamed through the windows, transforming the ordinary cafe into something that felt almost magical. She gathered her things slowly, noting how the simple act of existing in public without fear had become a small daily victory. 6 months ago, in that helicopter lifting off from Dust Devil, she couldn't have imagined finding peace in anonymity, but Michelle Weber's quiet life held unexpected gifts that Margaret Chen's driven existence had never allowed. Time to notice light patterns on cafe walls, freedom to read for pleasure rather than evidence, the luxury of caring about things that didn't matter to anyone's survival. Walking back toward her apartment, she passed the gallery where she worked, pausing to study the new exhibition through rain-spotted windows. Abstract landscapes, bold colors suggesting horizons that stretched beyond the canvas. The artist's statement spoke about transformation, about landscapes that existed in memory rather than geography. Michelle found herself thinking about Dust Devil as it might exist now. Not the dying town she'd left behind, but the imagined place her mother had tried to escape to, the home her grandfather had hoped to protect through his careful documentation. Her phone rang as she climbed the stairs to her second-floor apartment. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, which always triggered a moment of carefully controlled panic. Federal witnesses learned to fear unexpected contact. Michelle Weber. Ms. Weber, this is Dr. Patricia Vance from the University of Nevada. I'm researching the social history of small western towns, and I understand you might have family connections to the Dust Devil area. Michelle's hand tightened on the phone. I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong person. My apologies. I was given your name by someone who thought you might have information about Chinese immigrant families in that region during the mid-20th century. There are significant gaps in the historical record, and we're trying to piece together the experiences of communities that were often overlooked in official documentation. For a moment, Michelle saw her grandfather as he might have been in the researcher's theoretical study, not the town's secret record keeper, not a man trapped between survival and conscience, but simply another immigrant trying to build a life in an unforgiving landscape, someone whose story deserved to be told without the weight of buried crimes and inherited guilt. I can't help you, Michelle said gently. I hope your research goes well. She hung up and stood in her small kitchen, looking out at Portland's skyline as evening approached. Somewhere, academics would write papers about Dust Devil's collapse, analyzing the economic and social factors that led to its demise without ever understanding the human cost of truth-telling. The official record would show a federal investigation that exposed decades of corruption, leading to successful prosecutions and the dissolution of a criminal network. Clean, factual, missing the weight of personal sacrifice that made justice possible. Michelle opened her laptop and, for the first time since entering witness protection, began to write. Not an official statement or legal testimony, but something else, a record of her mother's courage, her grandfather's impossible position, her own stumbling path toward understanding that some silences were too expensive to maintain. She wrote about the woman who'd walked into the Broken Spur saloon 6 months ago, thinking she was settling a simple estate matter, and discovered instead that her entire family history had been constructed around a lie. 3 hours later, she had 5 pages that read like fiction, but contained more truth than any government document ever could. She saved the file as letter to someone I used to be and closed the laptop, knowing she would never send it anywhere, never show it to anyone. But writing it had been necessary, a way of honoring Margaret Chen's memory while accepting that Michelle Weber's life was the only one available now. As Portland settled into full darkness, Michelle made tea and returned to her book about the American West, reading about pioneers who'd traveled impossible distances to start over in places that barely existed on maps. She'd always imagined such journeys in terms of geography, crossing plains and mountains to reach new territory. Now she understood that the most difficult frontier was internal, the space between who you'd been and who you had to become when circumstances demanded complete transformation. Her reflection in the dark window showed a woman at peace with necessary choices. Michelle Weber would live quietly, work honestly, and carry the weight of justice served without expecting recognition or gratitude. The old Margaret would have found such obscurity unbearable. The new Michelle had learned that some victories were worth celebrating alone, in the safety of anonymity, watching rain wash city streets clean while remembering a town that no longer existed, but had finally, after 70 years of buried secrets, found its way to the truth. Outside, Portland hummed with the energy of people building ordinary lives, and Michelle Weber smiled, understanding at last that ordinary could be its own form of grace.